You don't even know what you're saying. Nathaniel Clark chuckled, the sound cold, dismissive. He tapped the edge of his wine glass with a finger, his eyes not leaving his phone as Olivia approached the table. He'd been to plenty of high-end restaurants before, and he'd seen more than his share of clueless waitstaff. This one, however, seemed particularly ripe for a little test. He smirked, the corners of his lips curling in anticipation of the moment he could make her squirm. She was young, probably just another hopeful in a city full of dreamers, and he could already tell she wasn't up to his standards. "I'm sure you've never heard someone speak French like that," he said without looking up. "I'll have the steak, medium rare, and a glass of your finest red, please." He didn't need to look at her to know her reaction. She'd probably stammer or look at the menu, pretending to understand what he meant. But then, he threw in the challenge. "Oh, and make it in French. If you can manage that, I might be impressed." Olivia didn't blink. Her gaze remained steady, and there was no hint of uncertainty in her eyes. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a polite smile, the kind of smile that didn't betray the quiet intelligence behind it. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice as smooth and calm as the finest silk. She turned on her heel and left, her movements graceful, but he could tell she was too eager to escape. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. He wasn't concerned. This wasn't the first time he'd thrown someone off their game like this. A few minutes later, Olivia returned, her steps soft, measured. This time, she spoke, her voice clear and precise, each word a perfect note in a symphony of perfect French. "Monsieur, je vais vous servir le plat in question, avec un vin excellent, si vous le souhaitez." She said it with such ease that Nathaniel almost missed the shift. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. He didn't know what he had expected, but it certainly wasn't that. His hand, which had been resting on the table, faltered. The smirk on his face faded. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Clark was at a loss for words. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the impact of her words lingered, settling deep in his chest. He glanced up at her, expecting some sign of hesitation, some recognition of the power dynamics at play, but there was nothing. Olivia's expression was unchanged, calm, almost regal. She wasn't intimidated by him, and that made Nathaniel uneasy in a way he hadn't felt before. His mind raced. He was the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the world, and yet here was this waitress, this young woman who had just served him a reality check in the most unexpected way. As she turned to leave, he couldn't help but watch her. His mind was spinning, a dozen thoughts racing, each more conflicting than the last. He had no idea what he had just witnessed, but one thing was certain, he would never look at her the same way again. He stared at the wine glass in front of him, his hand still lingering over it, but his thoughts elsewhere. Olivia had turned a simple dinner into something else entirely, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about people like her. He wasn't sure if he was impressed or just shaken by the realization that sometimes, the most unassuming people had the most to teach. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been schooled by the quietest person in the room. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt something close to respect. He just didn't know how to process it. Olivia returned a few moments later with his meal, her face still as calm as it had been when she spoke in French. She placed the plate in front of him without a word, but this time, there was no attempt to make small talk or to fill the silence. She simply nodded, turned, and walked away. As Nathaniel picked up his fork, he found himself staring at her retreating figure. He had heard her words, but it was something deeper that had stuck with him, something that felt important. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely in control, and it felt good. He took a bite of the steak, savoring the taste, but his mind kept drifting back to her, to the quiet power in her response, and he realized that sometimes silence could speak louder than words. Olivia didn't look back as she walked away, her mind focused on the task at hand. She moved through the crowded restaurant with a quiet confidence, her feet light but sure, like she had done this 1,000 times before. The hum of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft shuffle of servers made up the rhythm of the room. But in the midst of it, there was something different today. Something unsettled. She had never felt quite so seen. Not by him. Not by Nathaniel. It was a strange feeling, one that she wasn't sure how to process. She was used to being invisible, to blending into the background, to being nothing more than a part of the scenery in a room full of important people. But now, it felt as if the walls were closing in, the air thicker with the weight of his gaze lingering on her long after she had left his table. She adjusted her apron, taking a deep breath. She didn't have time to dwell on it. There were other tables to serve, other guests to tend to. As she rounded a corner, she caught sight of her reflection in the shiny surface of a silver serving tray. The woman staring back at her looked different today, like a version of herself she had buried long ago. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, and went to grab the next round of orders. But Nathaniel Clark's words echoed in her mind, his challenge, his surprise at her effortless response. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made an impression on him, if he had seen something in her that others never bothered to look for. She quickly pushed that thought away. He was just a customer, another powerful man who thought he could have whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. And she was just a waitress. Olivia didn't allow herself to think too much about her background, the things she had left behind to get here. But sometimes, when the nights were long and the hours dragged on, her mind wandered to the life she might have had, the life she had given up. She could have been a translator, working with languages for international organizations, traveling the world, making a name for herself. But then life had its own plans, and here she was, in this bustling restaurant, carrying plates of food to people who wouldn't even remember her name. As she returned to Nathaniel's table to check on his meal, she was careful not to look directly at him. She knew that he was still watching her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She set the plate down in front of him, her hands steady despite the chaos inside her. She was just doing her job, nothing more. But as she turned to leave, she heard him speak, his voice softer than before. "Wait." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected him to speak to her again, certainly not after the brief moment of recognition earlier. She turned around slowly, careful not to show the surprise she felt. "Yes, Mr. Clark?" she asked, her voice as neutral as ever. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're not like the others, are you?" he asked, his tone more curious than mocking now. Olivia didn't know how to answer that. Was he referring to the way she spoke? Or was it something deeper, something he had sensed that even she wasn't fully aware of? "I'm just here to do my job, sir," she replied, her tone still steady, though her pulse quickened. Nathaniel studied her for a moment longer, then sat back in his chair. "You're more than that," he said, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful. "Maybe, but it's enough for today." Olivia nodded politely and turned away, the conversation lingering in the air like smoke. As she walked back to the kitchen, she felt a knot forming in her stomach. She couldn't help but wonder what it was that he saw in her. But she quickly squashed the thought. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to make waves or get caught up in anyone's expectations. She was here to work, and that's all she would ever be. Olivia pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, her mind still racing. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. In fact, it happened every day. But today felt different. Today, something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what it meant yet, but for the first time in a long while, she wondered if maybe it was time for a change. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the way Nathaniel had looked at her, or the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her. It was the way the restaurant had felt that night. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift, as if everyone had been waiting for something to happen. And in some strange way, it had happened through her. The usual hum of the restaurant, the chatter of customers, the clinking of silverware against plates, all of it seemed to fade into the background. She felt the weight of her own presence, something she had never experienced before. She was just a waitress, wasn't she? Yet, here she was, caught in a moment with someone who had the power to change everything. She pushed those thoughts away, focusing on the task at hand. There was no time to dwell on it. Plates needed to be cleared, drinks needed to be served. But every time she passed Nathaniel's table, she couldn't help but steal a glance. He was no longer the arrogant billionaire she had once seen as nothing more than another customer. He was a man, and she was starting to see him as such. As the evening wore on, she caught him looking at her more often than she was comfortable with. His gaze was different now, sharper, more focused. She tried to brush it off, but she couldn't deny the way his presence seemed to follow her through the restaurant. At one point, as she was refilling a water glass, she heard him speak again. This time, his voice was quieter, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "You're not like the others," he said. Olivia froze for a moment, unsure if he was talking to her or just thinking aloud. She turned toward him, keeping her expression neutral. "Excuse me?" she asked, trying to keep her tone even. He didn't look up from his plate, but his words hung in the air between them. "I've met a lot of people in my life, Olivia. But you're different." His voice was soft, and for the first time, she sensed a hint of vulnerability in it. She swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She didn't know how to respond. She had never expected anything like this. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Clark," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "I know," he said quietly, "but I think you're capable of more than just serving food." Olivia didn't know how to answer that. She didn't want to read too much into his words. She had heard them before, people telling her she was meant for more, that she was wasting her potential. But what did that mean for her? What was she supposed to do with all of this? She could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she turned to walk away, and she hated how it made her heart race. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to let someone like him disrupt that. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Nathaniel didn't leave until the restaurant was nearly empty, and even as he stood to go, he didn't look at her with the same dismissive attitude he had when he first arrived. Instead, he gave her a small nod, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment longer than necessary. Olivia quickly looked away, focusing on clearing the last of the plates. As he walked out, she felt a strange emptiness settle over her. It wasn't that she wanted anything from him. It wasn't that she needed his approval. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, something that made her feel seen. For the first time in years, she wondered if maybe she had been hiding too long, if maybe there was something more she could be doing. But that wasn't who she was. She was just Olivia, the waitress. Nothing more. She had made her peace with that. As she walked out of the kitchen to take a break, she found herself standing by the back door, staring out into the dark street. The city was quiet now, the usual hum of traffic and voices replaced by the soft rustle of the wind. It was strange how empty it felt, how alone she felt in this moment. But at the same time, there was a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't know where it came from or what it meant, but it was there. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to feel it. Olivia sat in the small break room, the fluorescent lights above, buzzing softly. She absent-mindedly traced the rim of her coffee cup, her mind still lingering on Nathaniel Clark and the strange encounter from earlier. The way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her, it wasn't just the usual dismissive tone of a wealthy customer. No, there had been something else. Respect? Curiosity? She couldn't quite put her finger on it. She had always kept her head down, focused on the task at hand. That's how she got through each day. But something in his gaze had made her question whether she had been hiding behind this uniform all these years. She quickly shook her head, dismissing the thought. She didn't have time for this. There were bills to pay, and her mother's medical bills were mounting. The weight of responsibility had always kept her grounded, focused on survival, not dreams. She stood up, tossing her empty cup into the trash. It was time to get back to work. As she entered the dining area, the usual buzz of conversation filled the air. The restaurant was almost full, as it always was at this hour. The rich and powerful gathered here, talking business, making deals, and pretending to be untouchable. Olivia moved between the tables, serving drinks and clearing plates, her mind still on Nathaniel. She tried to push him out of her thoughts, but it was impossible. His words, his stare, had lodged themselves in her mind like a splinter, refusing to leave. She moved to a table near the back, where a couple sat, laughing softly. She took their drink order and turned to walk away, but something made her pause. Nathaniel was sitting at his usual spot by the window, his gaze locked on her once again. This time, there was no mockery, no arrogance, just stillness. She felt the familiar tension in her chest. Was he looking at her again? Did he expect something? She could feel the weight of his eyes on her as she turned back to the kitchen. It was ridiculous, she thought. He was just another customer. But why did it feel different? She brushed it off and focused on the task at hand. A few minutes later, Olivia returned to Nathaniel's table, trying to keep her composure. He was sitting back in his chair, sipping his wine, and staring out the window. She placed the next round of drinks on the table and moved to leave, But Nathaniel's voice stopped her again. "Olivia," he said, his tone steady, but there was something almost softer in it now. She turned to face him, her heart racing slightly. "Yes, Mr. Clark?" she asked, her voice calm despite the flutter in her chest. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to do something else? Something more?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since she had walked over. Olivia blinked, unsure how to respond. This wasn't the Nathaniel she was used to. He wasn't making demands or throwing challenges her way. He was asking her a question, a real one. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. I don't know what you mean," she said, unsure if she even wanted to answer him. "You're capable of more than this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can see it in you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Olivia felt a knot form in her stomach. She had heard these kinds of things before, but never from someone like him. Never from someone who held so much power. She could feel the room grow quieter, as if the world had paused around them. She didn't want to admit it, but his words had struck a chord. She had always kept her ambitions buried deep behind the mask of a waitress trying to make ends meet. But now, in this moment, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't a new feeling, but it was one she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. She looked at him, unsure of what to say next. "I'm just here to do my job, Mr. Clark," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes, doing your job means something more than you think." He paused, then stood up, straightening his jacket. "Think about it, Olivia. Think about what you could do if you didn't limit yourself to what you know now." He placed a generous tip on the table, then turned to leave, but not before giving her one last glance. "You're not just a waitress," he said softly, almost to himself. "You're something more." Olivia stood there for a long moment, staring at the tip he left behind, the words echoing in her mind. Something more. What did that even mean? She couldn't answer that right now, but deep down, she knew one thing. The world had just shifted beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure where it was going to take her. But for the first time, she was willing to find out. The days that followed felt different to Olivia. Each morning as she prepared for work, there was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to change. She walked through the narrow streets of the city, the cold autumn wind brushing against her skin, but her thoughts weren't on the chill or the passing cars. They were on Nathaniel, on the words he had left her with. "You're not just a waitress. You're something more." She had replayed those words in her mind over and over, trying to figure out what they meant. He was right in some ways. She had never allowed herself to dream of anything else, never thought there was anything more for her than this. But now, after everything that had happened, she couldn't help but wonder, what if she was capable of more? What if Nathaniel had seen something in her that even she had hidden away? As the days passed, Olivia found herself noticing things she had never paid attention to before. The way the sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, the little moments when her customers smiled at her, the sense of accomplishment after a long shift. But those moments weren't enough anymore. She began to question the path she had chosen, the one she had been walking for years without ever considering if it was the right one. She had learned to suppress her ambitions, to silence the voice inside her that wanted more, that wanted to be seen, to be heard. But now, it was louder than ever. One evening, after another long shift, Olivia found herself sitting in the small break room again. The noise of the restaurant felt distant, like it was coming from another world. She stared at her reflection in the mirror on the wall, not recognizing the woman staring back at her. She had always been the quiet one, the one who took orders and followed through. But something had shifted. She wasn't content to just be invisible anymore. She wanted to matter. She wanted to be more than just the girl who served drinks and cleared plates. She had a mind, a voice, and she was starting to realize that maybe it was time to use them. But how? Where did she even start? She didn't have the luxury of a formal education or a clear path to follow. The weight of her responsibilities, her mother's medical bills, her need to stay afloat, all of that seemed to pull her back down every time she tried to rise above it. Yet, there was still something stirring inside her. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more for her than this. As Olivia sat in silence, she made a decision. She would start small. She would begin to take steps, however tiny, towards something bigger. Maybe it was a career change. Maybe it was going back to school. Maybe it was finding a way to make her voice heard. She didn't know yet, but she was willing to find out. The next morning, she walked into the restaurant with a new sense of purpose. She still had the same uniform, the same job, the same routine, but there was a shift in her. She moved with more intention, her steps more purposeful. The customers still didn't notice her in the way Nathaniel had, but she didn't mind. She wasn't doing it for them anymore. She was doing it for herself. As the evening came, Nathaniel walked into the restaurant again. He was seated at his usual spot by the window, the same confident air about him. But Olivia didn't feel the same flutter of nervousness she had the first time he had entered. She walked past his table, noticing that he looked up at her this time, his eyes briefly meeting hers. For a second, she thought she saw something in his gaze, something that wasn't just the usual calculation or indifference. Maybe it was a hint of acknowledgement, or maybe she was imagining it. But for the first time, it didn't matter. She was no longer waiting for validation from him or anyone else. Olivia had taken the first step toward her own path, and she was ready to see where it would lead her. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of routine. Olivia had kept her head down, focusing on her work and pushing away the thoughts of what might lie beyond the walls of the restaurant. Yet, something within her had shifted. Each day she walked through the doors, there was a new determination in her step, a quiet resolve that wasn't there before. She no longer felt invisible, even if the world still saw her as just another waitress. There was power in knowing who you were, and Olivia was starting to understand that. She was capable of so much more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. The voice of doubt, the one that had told her she wasn't enough, started to fade into the background. Instead, there was a quiet strength growing within her. It wasn't something she had to prove to anyone else. It was something she was finally doing for herself. Nathaniel, as it turned out, had become a quiet presence in her life. Not that he was constantly there, but there were moments when their paths crossed. Occasionally, he would look at her in that way, curious, almost as if he was searching for something in her. She couldn't decide if it made her uncomfortable or if it was just another sign that she was changing. She wasn't sure if he had noticed the shift in her or if it was something she had imagined. But the last time he had been in the restaurant, she had caught him staring at her, not in the way he had before. This time, there was something more. He wasn't just looking at her as a waitress. He seemed to be looking deeper, as if he was seeing her for who she really was. It unsettled her, but also, for the first time in a long while, she didn't mind. She was no longer waiting for approval from anyone. Her thoughts were interrupted when she was called to the front. A group of regulars was seated at their usual table, laughing and joking, their voices filling the space around her. It was a familiar scene, one she had seen 100 times before. But today, she felt different. She was different. The words she spoke were still polite, still professional, but there was a new confidence behind them. As she walked to Nathaniel's table, she didn't feel the usual tension in her chest. She no longer cared about his gaze or his expectations. She was there to do her job, yes, but more than that, she was there to do it with a sense of purpose. Nathaniel looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Olivia," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something she couldn't place. "You're different today." She paused for a moment, unsure how to respond. It wasn't a question, more of an observation. She gave a small, polite smile, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. "Maybe," she said simply. "Maybe I've always been this way." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if processing her words. He didn't respond immediately, instead watching her for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Maybe you have," he muttered, as though to himself. Olivia felt a strange sense of satisfaction in that moment. She didn't need him to understand her or to acknowledge her worth. She was finally acknowledging it for herself. As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was on her way to something more, not because anyone else had told her she was capable, but because she had started to believe it herself. And that was all that mattered. Days passed, and Olivia continued to settle into the new rhythm of her life. It was subtle, the change, but it was there. She had stopped doubting herself so much. She walked a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and no longer felt like a ghost moving through the motions of her daily routine. The weight of other people's expectations no longer bore down on her the way it once had. It wasn't that she had all the answers. She still didn't know exactly where her life was headed, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Nathaniel's words echoed in her mind occasionally, but they no longer felt like a burden. They were a reminder that perhaps there was more for her, more that she was capable of, and that realization was enough to shift something deep inside her. The restaurant, however, remained the same. The same busy evenings, the same guests, the same routine. But there was one difference. She no longer felt like an invisible part of it. One evening, as Olivia was making her rounds, she was stopped by one of the managers. "Olivia, can you check on the VIP table in the back?" he asked, handing her a new order. She nodded and made her way toward the table, where a group of well-dressed men were seated. As she approached, she saw Nathaniel among them, his back to her as he engaged in conversation with his colleagues. It wasn't the first time he'd been in, but something about tonight felt different. She approached the table, and as usual, he noticed her before she could speak. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, she hesitated. But then she caught herself, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Clark," she said smoothly, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to how she might have reacted months ago. He looked at her for a brief moment before offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Olivia," he replied, his voice just as steady as hers. She noticed how different the moment felt. There was no challenge in his eyes, no sense of superiority. It was just a simple acknowledgement. As she went about taking their orders and checking on their needs, Olivia found herself thinking back to her first encounter with Nathaniel. How she had been unsure of herself, trying to figure out where she fit in this world of wealth and power. Now, it didn't seem so intimidating. It was just another part of her reality, a reality she was beginning to own. As the evening wore on, Olivia continued her rounds. The small changes in her demeanor didn't go unnoticed by some of the staff, and it didn't escape Nathaniel's attention either. He watched her as she moved through the room with quiet confidence, and for the first time, he didn't see the girl in the waitress uniform. He saw someone with purpose, someone who wasn't just here to serve, but to take charge of her own life. After finishing up with the last of his colleagues, Nathaniel caught her attention before she could leave. "Olivia," he called softly. She turned to face him, not sure what to expect. "I know you're busy, but," he paused, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "I've been thinking. You should consider exploring other opportunities. You're good at what you do here, but I can tell you have more to offer." The words caught her off guard. She had never expected him to say anything like this again. But now, they didn't have the weight they once did. "I'm doing just fine, Mr. Clark," she replied, her smile small but genuine. "I'm herself." She had been avoiding him for months, keeping her distance from that part of herself that he had awakened. But not tonight. Tonight, she was ready to face whatever came her way. She walked toward his table, her movements steady and confident, her eyes meeting his for the first time without hesitation. Nathaniel looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable at first. "Olivia," he said, his voice calm. "How are you?" It was such a simple question, but for some reason, it hit her harder than she expected. She had been asked that question countless times, but somehow, with him, it felt different. "I'm doing well, Mr. Clark," she said, her voice steady, but there was a softness in it she couldn't quite hide. He smiled slightly, a gesture that felt rare coming from him. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Olivia stood there for a second, unsure of what to say next. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open up to him, to share anything beyond the professional walls she had carefully built around herself. But there was something about the way he was looking at her, something that told her he wasn't asking to be polite. He genuinely cared. "You've changed," he said after a beat, his eyes studying her closely. "You seem different." Olivia hesitated before replying. "I've just been finding my way," she said, the words coming out more easily than she had expected. Nathaniel nodded slowly, as if understanding exactly what she meant. There was no judgment in his eyes, no need to push further. "I'm glad to see you're finding it," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the restaurant, the clatter of plates and glasses, faded into the background as they sat in the shared silence. Olivia had always been afraid of being seen, of being too much, too loud. But in this moment, with Nathaniel across from her, she realized that maybe being seen wasn't something to be afraid of. Maybe it was what she had been needing all along. "Thank you," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Nathaniel looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said. You're the one who's made the change. Olivia smiled faintly, feeling the